Hey guys, Dr. Stitzel here. So here's a video based on a book called Introduction to Austrian Economics by Steve Horowitz. I almost used this book as the course and kind of the backbone of the entire course. And that's because this book taught me more about microeconomics than I think maybe I have ever learned, but if not, close to it. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to extract a portion of this textbook that pieces together this idea called the market process. And the reason that I want to do that is because this is going to be a completely unique way of thinking about how markets work in general and why it's a process. And we'll take away a lot of big lessons out of this video. So this is probably one of the most important videos of the entire course. Now, I've chosen to sort of set this part of the market process in this section on prices and as a fit for the overall class. And I'm doing that very intentionally. And this will inform many of the things that we do later on in this course. So let me start where Dr. Horowitz starts, which is with the marginal revolution. So the marginal revolution is a movement in the 1870s in economics that really started the Austrian school influence on mainstream economics. Now, economics has become more and more mathematical. We're going to talk about that a bunch later on in this video, but most of our philosophical underpinnings of microeconomics is going to come from the stuff that we're going to talk about here. So the marginal revolution is related to value and what we call thinking on the margin, an idea we've already met. But let me start with a really powerful idea and an explanation of how marginal revolution starts. How marginal revolution explains things that we see in the world around us that we might not otherwise be able to explain. And I'm going to use this idea about water as we go. This is one of the classic lessons in economics, microeconomics in particular. And this is the value of water versus diamonds, right? So an idea we're going to talk about here in a second, the labor theory of value, or really any other theory of value, doesn't allow us to explain what's called the water-diamond paradox. Water is essential for human life, but it's very cheap, whereas diamonds are a luxury item, are very expensive. So if the value of goods should be somehow tied to the price of goods, how can it be that diamonds are more valuable, more expensive than water, given that water is literally one of the most key things for human survival? This is part of what the marginal revolution solved. What matters for value is not the total value, but rather it's the marginal value, right? So not the total value, it's the marginal value of the good. So it's the marginal utility, the value of a particular portion of the whole supply that's consumed at any given time that gives value to that particular, or sets the price really. So the value of a gallon of water is small because most people don't have a pressing need for one marginal gallon. On the contrast, a carat is very valuable because the marginal unit is highly demanded. So the total value of diamond is much lower than the total value of water, but the marginal value of a diamond very high compared to the marginal value of water. Another way to think about this is if you were stranded in a desert island, the marginal value of water would be really, really high, and the marginal value of the diamond would be very low. This resolves the water-diamond paradox, but it also provides us with a new way to think about value and price. So the Austrian school begins this marginal revolution because up until that point, every economist, Adam Smith, all the way to Karl Marx, hold what's called the labor theory of value, which is that the labor as an input into things is what gives them value, right? There's all these things out there, we have to organize them. So there's sort of this appealing misunderstanding happening that labor gives things its value. And all economists hold this up until the Austrian school sort of gets its start with the marginal revolution. So a value of a good or service is explained by the cost of producing it, which has a sort of intuitive appeal, but has several really obvious problems. One is how to measure labor is really, really difficult because it can't just be hours, right? The hours spent by somebody very skillful in something is different than hours spent making the same thing by somebody who's not skillful. So education, skill, any number of costs related to the input are very, very hard to measure. And the value of sudden discovery, something that we discover serendipitously, can't be explained by labor theory of value at all, right? So we discover things that have tremendous value to us accidentally. How can that be explained by labor? But the marginal value of something explains this perfectly. And this goes hand in hand with an idea that I've talked about a bunch already in this class, is that subjective value. So the value of a good or service is the result of a subjective perception of the usefulness to the consumer of the specific amount required for the use at hand, i.e. the marginal amount. We're going to throw away this idea of intrinsic value. Goods don't have intrinsic value, and their values are not determined by the amount of labor or other inputs that go into producing them. Instead, goods have value because people think they're useful, and the specific amount that they the specific amount that they need gives value to the particular quantity they end up needing. So this satisfies the user's specific wants. Let's take an example from a book I've already mentioned, one of the most important economic books of all time. That's Human Action. So suppose for a second that we're considering this idea of choosing how to trade for a good. We're going to leave money out of it. I'm going to come to money later on. Let's take an example of I want to stay dry, right? I have a couple of options for that, right? I can have this raincoat, or I can have 100 logs that I can then build into a cabin, right? So a cabin protects me much better than a raincoat, right? But suppose I have fewer than 30 logs. Suppose that fewer than 30 logs are available, then I can only use them for sort of a makeshift windbreak. I can't really use them to build an entire log cabin, right? And so that protects me a little bit, but not nearly as useful. So if I'm the owner of 95 logs, then I would be really happy to trade a raincoat in order to get 5 logs. That's the value of the logs there. But we have this idea often in society that the goods must have some intrinsic value to them. How could you trade a raincoat for 5 logs? Like, that's a ridiculous trade, right? But if on the other hand I only have 10 logs and I need 100 to build the cabin, then if you offer me 10 logs in exchange for my raincoat, I'll say no, because what good is 20 logs? I need 100 in order to build it. So the price of the logs might be 1 raincoat if there's 5 of them and I have 95. But if I have 10, even 10 of them or 20 of them are useless to me. I won't trade my raincoat in exchange for them, right? Okay. This would then carry over to any number of examples, and those would be manifold. I just like that idea of what's the value of a set of logs. Depends on my raincoat, depends on, even more importantly, the number of logs I already have, and what the value of that good is given the specific use that I have in mind. Okay, let's turn now to an economist named Carl Menger. So Carl Menger actually introduced this idea of subjective value, and part of what he did is expand this invisible hand idea from Adam Smith that we've already met in this class, right? Menger offers explanation as to the social phenomenon that begin with the choices of individuals and show how the outcome of those choices result in things that none of the individuals had planned. This is that emergent order idea that we've met earlier and often in this class. So this is what's called the Mengerian question, named after Charles Menger. How can it be that institutions which serve the common welfare and are extremely significant for its development come into being without a common will directed toward establishing them? This is that human design versus human action. So this is human action, but it's not human design. This later becomes called spontaneous order theory. Again, I've talked a bunch about that in this class because this is one of the most important things that we can learn in economics. This is also at the heart of Austrian economics and why I want to introduce us to this school of thought that's so critical to the history of economics. So understanding social phenomena are understanding how social phenomena are the unintended outcomes of human choice filter through various social institutions and an analytical technique Austrians use in order to do economics and social science. So this unintended consequences idea that we've seen before is how Austrians understand social science in general and economics in specific. So spontaneous order explanations rest on the concept of subjectivism and limited knowledge, both ideas we've met before. We've talked about subjectivism today, noted earlier. So it's precisely because our knowledge is partial and local that we rely on social institutions rather than specific design and the control of experts to coordinate our behavior. Right? So one of the things we want to keep in mind is incomplete knowledge hampers both the individual and the expert. Right? So our claim here is that broad implications for political economy rest on the nature of economics. Right? So that self-interested idea that we have is actually what makes the invisible hand work. It puts the order in spontaneous order. So having the right set of social and economic institutions provide the feedback and incentives necessary to properly channel self-interest. So we need incentives. Incentives matter. Remember, that's one of our big lessons. Incentives matter. And we need those feedback loops. You should recognize this from our story about the ultimate chain letter. Okay, one of the things that we want, one of these social and economic institutions, is property rights. So as long as property rights are clearly defined and well enforced, production and exchange are more likely and market prices will reflect value. The search for profit, which we're going to talk about a bunch later, provide these goods and services that we want, this emergent order. Where property rights are not clear and public policy distorts the cost-facing entrepreneurs, that self-interested search for profit will not produce the same level of benefit for the public. It's part of why we don't want intervention. The invisible hand generates good outcomes when the rules of the game are clear and they provide the right kind of feedbacks and incentives. The efficacy of economic process then, and this is an Austrian school idea, it's not the result of the behavior of the individuals nearly as much as it is having the right institutions in place for those individuals to act under. So when I say institution in this case, I mean economic freedom, I mean freedom of speech, I mean property rights, I mean the rule of law, and I mean contract enforcement. So economic progress then comes not from the pursuit of self-interest or from rational choice, but from having the right structure in which self-interest and rational choice cause those actions to benefit everyone involved, including the individual and the people that they interact with. So this provides that insight that Adam Smith had called the invisible hand with a clear foundation from economics to society. Next, let's talk about cost and marginal value. So this is where we'll get many of these types of insights that we might not otherwise have had. And we're going to do that going back to our idea talking about water. Suppose, and let's rank some uses for water. I have some different kind of uses for water, and we rank them from most important to least important. This is how you would use a scarce resource, and this is what Menger called economizing. So our first attempt is to simply take things that are at our disposal and allocate them to the most urgent wants. Notice that I'm saying wants and not needs here, right? Because wants will cover needs, but needs won't cover wants. So I rank my 4 wants from most important to least and satisfy the most urgent with this gallon of water first. Then I take my second most urgent want, and I satisfy that second, and so forth on until I satisfy all my wants. So if I can only obtain 3 gallons, right, the least want, the 4th want, will go unsatisfied. We can illustrate several really key ideas here. We take each of these uses, right, and we subjectively rank, and then we can attach subjective value then to each unit of the thing that I would consume, right? So water in general has benefit because of the things that I might do with it. I might drink it, wash the car, wash the windows, water the garden, right? So whatever I select first then is my most important, by my subjective valuation, use of that water. So the fact that each want requires a specific amount of water then lets us see the importance of that want on the margin. My determination of how much value water has for me will depend on how I evaluate the importance of each gallon I'm currently considering obtaining. That's that economic exchange that we always talk about. And the importance of that gallon of water will in turn depend on the importance I attach to the want that I'm aiming to satisfy. So the importance is not happiness, right? It's not a hedonic feeling. This is what we're going to get in a lot of other microeconomics courses, that is really too narrow of a view of how people make decisions. But rather, it's the importance that I associate with satisfying a want on the margin, right? So our satisfying of a want happens on the margin. That gives us marginal value. So the importance of any good to an individual depends on the importance she attaches to the want that the marginal unit of that good will satisfy. Let me say that again. The value of any good to an individual depends on the importance she attaches to the want that marginal unit of the good will satisfy. So if the gallon of water in front of her allows her to satisfy the desire of washing her car, then the value of that water is linked to the importance she places on her car being clean. This example also helps us understand this core idea of opportunity cost and diminishing marginal utility, and how these things are linked to subjective value. So opportunity cost usually, and I've already defined it earlier in this class, as the value of the next best alternative given up when making a choice. That's right, and because we face scarcity, choosing one thing means we have to give up the next best thing. Classic opportunity cost. Our gallon of water example illustrates this really beautifully. If we have 3 gallons of water, what is our opportunity cost? Well, it's whichever thing we end up having to leave unsatisfied. Suppose the third most valued thing was to water the garden, and the fourth was to wash our windows. Conventional economics says the opportunity cost of watering the garden is washing the windows. That's very true. And this perspective that we're presenting here, though, adds 2 very important elements. First, that opportunity cost is subjective. I can't make this point strongly enough. Only the chooser in this case knows exactly the importance she attaches to watering the garden versus washing the windows. In this way, her opportunity cost cannot be objectively measured. It's subjective. It's her valuation of that. Your valuation of the watering the garden versus washing the windows is very different than hers. Or maybe it's the same, but it's subjective to yourself. Second, and maybe even more importantly, this opportunity cost is never actually experienced because it's a choice that's foregone. It's a choice we didn't make. Opportunity cost is ultimately your expectation of the importance of the sacrificed option. So you're making that calculation, but because you never get to experience, it's actually foregone. This never experienced idea then is critical for understanding why we can't make choices seeing these set of actions that are happening out there so we can make some kind of policy decision based on that. We can't, because these things are never experienced. The very fact that she chose to water the garden means she never did wash the windows, and so she never experienced exactly how important it was to satisfy that want. So she makes the best choices that she can, but in the end, when we choose among subjective expected utilities of our different options. So the option we evaluate to be the most important of those not chosen is therefore not experienced. I always ask students to start out the class, if you're listening to this video, if you're coming to this class, what would you be doing instead? And the student says, well, I'd be taking a nap, or I'd be eating lunch, or I'd be watching Netflix, etc. But because they're in class, that means they're not experiencing those things. And so sometimes we're going to have a better sense, and sometimes we'll have a less strong sense of what the value attached to those is. So the option we evaluate to be the most important of those not chosen, is still not experienced. Okay, so the opportunity cost is the subjective expected utility that we thought that thing would bring, and we can never know for certain what the opportunity cost was ex post, sort of after the fact, because we didn't make that choice. This really helps us flesh out this idea of diminishing marginal utility. Diminishing marginal utility, classic economic idea, and it comes out of this school of thought that we're presenting here because it's that marginal revolution idea again. So the idea of marginal utility looks different from this perspective as well. Normally, we present this topic and we say the more you consume of a good, the less good feeling, that hedonic idea, what's the feeling that you get from consuming it. And so when I was teaching my other class earlier this week, I said, well, okay, we drink one beer. What kind of benefit do we get? We drink another beer. What kind of benefit do we get? Oh, that's less. That's an idea of diminishing marginal utility. But if you're in this class, you're going to end up smarter than the other class because I can teach you something deeper here. So while the traditional idea is you eat the first piece of cake, you drink the first beer, it tastes great, but eventually successive pieces will taste less and less good, will benefit less from them. This explanation, of course, treats utility as hedonic rather than as a capacity to satisfy a want. In our gallons of water example, the marginal utility of water is the importance attached to each gallon in relationship to its ability to satisfy a want, not merely how good it feels. The next gallon might be for drinking, our next most important want, followed by watering the garden and washing the windows. So the marginal utility of each gallon is less than the previous one because the importance we attach to it declines. Because the importance we attach to the want it satisfies declines. Although we can say that a marginal utility always declines as we obtain successive units of good, we can't put a number on that utility because we forwent that choice. The value there is subjective, but it's also expected. This takes us beautifully into a new way to think about supply and demand. We've already taught supply and demand in this class. We took that very nice, straightforward idea, but that's right and good and a useful way to think about the world. And hopefully, I teased out the idea of production and the importance of prices, etc. there. But we have a new insight here, a new way to look at supply and demand. So what Menger argued is value flows not from the inputs to the outputs, but from the outputs to the input. So what it is that we eventually produce is what gives it value. I've argued that several times already in this class from different points of view, but now we're looking at the view that Menger brings, right? So it's because those outputs are valued by consumers that the inputs end up getting value. Let's take an example like Horowitz uses in his book. It's Big Macs, right? So you have inputs like beef patties, a special sauce, cheese, etc., and the labor of the employees that goes into them. But if people stop eating beef, maybe for moral reasons, all of the factors of the production that go into making Big Macs lose some value. And it's therefore not the labor that makes the good valuable, or the intrinsic value of the beef, but rather people's belief that certain goods satisfy their wants that gives value to the labor and materials that go into producing them. Therefore, the ultimate source of value is subjective preference and knowledge of each consumer. So the knowledge that each consumer has, not the producer's knowledge of individual consumers. Notice that this transference of value from outputs to inputs is not automatic. Someone has to go and figure out A, that people value some of those outputs more than others, and B, which outputs and what process, by the way, best make those outputs. This brings us to a key idea that we want to really focus on in economics, and that's the idea of the entrepreneur. We'll talk more about this in a moment, so I'm going to set it aside and talk about this new supply and demand in the context of prices and money, and that'll bring us back around to the entrepreneur. Okay, so before, remember, we left out the idea of money, and we just talked about how marginal value and subjective value explained things. But in fact, Menger actually argues money will be a spontaneous development because we'll figure out where these things overlap, and rather than having to try to find each bilateral trade that we would want to make, we'll find common goods, and those will serve the function of money. Remember, money is a service, not a good. Okay, so before we just assumed people would somehow acquire the goods through trade, but of course, consumers are actually facing many different options with their choices. Money will help them navigate that. Okay. So in deciding whether to buy a gallon of water for, say, $2, the consumer is actually choosing between the expected subjective utility use of that gallon of water for the next most important thing it could satisfy, want it could satisfy, and the expected subjective utility of the most urgent, unsatisfying want that the $2 could satisfy using some other good, purchasing some other good or service. So the ability to use money to buy any good or service means that we implicitly rank the expected subjective utilities of all the alternative wants, that's opportunity cost, we might satisfy with a given amount of money, right? So we have that money, we could spend it on water and satisfy that want, or we could spend it on something else and satisfy a totally different want altogether. So as we see here, the existence of prices then helps us navigate what would be otherwise an incredibly complex and probably impossible set of choices. How do I choose what to consume? Well, without prices to help allow me to compare, it becomes an impossible problem. A gallon of water versus a cake or a Big Mac, right? Those would be impossible comparisons if I couldn't translate that into a common unit of account, which we call money, and we most usually think of currency, right? But many things would actually work in that case. So we can use this money and supply and demand framework to really explore some new explanations for why people increase their quantity demanded as the price of something falls, right? We've talked about that idea of why we demand things more when price falls, but we can learn a few new things here. Okay, so your willingness to purchase more or fewer gallons of water to satisfy some or all of the wants that we had before will depend on your comparison of the price of the gallon of water with the importance you attach to getting each of the wants satisfied. For example, suppose you're willing to pay $3 to wash your car, but not to satisfy your thirst. If the price were $2.50, then you'd pay the price for the gallon to wash the car, and perhaps you'd also be willing to pay the price to satisfy your thirst. As the price falls further, your third and fourth ranks suddenly might become worth satisfying. The lower price, the more willing people are to satisfy lower ranked wants. This goes all the way back to those ideas that we were talking about earlier in the class. Price signals the information on the scarcity of the good available. That comes all the way back to these Austrian school ideas. Okay, what if price goes the other way? If the price raises to $4, you might decide it's not worth it to wash your car or satisfy any of the lesser ranked wants at that price. Thus, demand curve is a reflection of the diminishing marginal utility. The declining importance of each want implies that we are willing to sacrifice to satisfy those wants must be progressively less as we satisfy less important wants. At higher prices, we'll look for the more important wants to satisfy. When the prices fall, we're more willing to satisfy lower ranked wants. Right. Straightforward economizing, this beautifully explains how prices interact with our normal behavior of choosing how to satisfy things. This gives us that downward sloping demand curve that we think is so beautiful from a market study, right? As prices fall, people wish to buy more units of a good, and as prices rise, people buy fewer because it satisfies lower and higher ranked wants. The same then applies to supply. And in fact, supply is just demand in disguise. Let's study an example. If we have 4 gallons of water and you want to convince me to part with one of them, it won't necessarily take very much because that gallon might be used for my least important want, washing the windows in the case that we've gone to so far. Since I don't value that end very highly, it won't take much to get me to give it up. But if you want me to also give up watering my garden, by selling you a second gallon of water, the price will have to be higher because I value watering the garden more than I valued washing the windows, because that importance of the marginal good is higher. It's a greater want that I would satisfy. So as the price of the good rises, people will increase the quantity of the good they supply because at progressively higher prices, they are more likely to give up satisfying more important wants. Again, you can see how that's demand because other wants that aren't related to the water can then get satisfied, and those would have to be higher ranked wants as well. So higher prices give us a greater quantity supplied, and lower prices mean lesser quantity supplied. There you go, upward sloping demand curve. Okay, finally, as I said a moment ago, notice that supply here is just demand in disguise. I'm more willing to part with additional gallons of water as I'm offered more money in return, money I can then use to satisfy more important wants than the water-related ones I'm giving up. This works just as well for labor as it does any other type of supply, which really completes the circle as the whole of the economy can be analyzed. So the amount of money then that I get for my water is in turn determined by other people's demand for water. So it's this interplay of demand that creates supply. They're saying their unsatisfied wants that require water are important enough for them to try to bid the water away from me. The more important those ends are to them, the more willing they are to pay to fulfill them. So humans attempting to acquire the means they believe will satisfy their wants, as they perceive to be important, is where economics begins. Again, human action. You're tired of me saying it at this point. So we'll continue. Now let's get to that market process idea that's so important to us. Okay, so currently modern economics begins with prices, and that's because they're very important. But they kind of have it backwards. They begin with prices, and then they see, okay, well, how much do people demand or supply from those prices, right? So the goal of those approaches is to find a set of prices and quantities at which everyone is able to maximize their utility and profit given the choices of others. Notice that we haven't really done that in this class. Rather, we take the Mengerian approach. We take the individual action, and we see how the purposeful actions of individuals interact with each other through an ongoing process that happens in real time to produce the particular prices and quantities we see at any given moment, right? Humans are imperfect choosers humans are imperfect choosers acting on the basis of limited knowledge, right? So limited knowledge, individual action, that's where we started in this class, because we're not sort of cheating to get the math to work out easy, and instead we're taking this approach of understanding how humans actually behave. They act individually, and they act with a limited set of knowledge, right? So this school of thought, and really all of good philosophical economics, sees the market as a process by which partially informed people learn from each other and discover along the way what it is that others want and how best to produce it. And that means that supply curve comes from their own individual demand curve, right? Key to this process is that idea we introduced before, the entrepreneur, right? So we'll explore the entrepreneur more here in just a moment. But for now, we want to understand that the entrepreneur pushes the process forward of discovering more knowledge, because each individual has limited knowledge and the entrepreneur wants to find their niche, right? This is why any snapshot, any static analysis, which is something we've talked about earlier in the class and something I always talk about when I talk about markets, when I draw these supply and demand curves, it gives us this kind of static analysis. But that fails to capture markets in a certain way, because markets are always in a state of transition. They're a process, so human knowledge is changing over time. So the effectiveness of a market is not about how it compares to an ideal at any point in time, but rather how easily people can learn from their mistakes and whether their incentives are correct, in that they encourage people to fix those mistakes, right? Because real-world markets never actually settle into a final equilibrium. We're always evaluating the performance of the market in ways in which we get actual disequilibrium prices, serve to provide the knowledge and incentives people need to better coordinate their plans. Right, so we're never arrived. We're always trying to improve. Okay, so that leads us to sort of the culmination of understanding the discovery process. And that starts with an idea that we're going to present later on in this class, which is this idea of perfect competition. And we're going to teach that in this class, and I think it has its place, but I really want to prime you to think carefully about what's going to happen when we get there, because the perfect competition model, as it is often presented in more mathematical economics ideas, is that it thinks the idea of competition is a static state of affairs, but rather we want to understand this as a dynamic process. Really, I think if I asked you before you started this video, do you think you'd rather learn about a dynamic market process or a static one, you would pick dynamic because you would understand that's how humans actually live and behave. So really what happens is the function of markets is a dynamic one in order to spread knowledge, right? We want to learn things about what's happening in the world and the way that people value things in order that we can make our best set of decisions. So the key assumption in perfect competition is that actors have perfect knowledge. But as we talked about before, Hayek has sort of undone this idea, pointing out that such an assumption really assumes away the central problem of human action. So it's only through the process of competition that we will actually have facts be discovered. And Hayek says the function of competition then is to teach us who and what will serve us well. Right? Coordination, you might recognize that idea. Right? So by creating a model where people are assumed to know everything they need, mainstream economics sort of can miss the point. Right? So we really want to underlie our understanding of markets with an understanding of competition rather than the other way around. Markets then enable us to overcome the limits of partial knowledge and inarticulate knowledge. Remember, that's that idea. Some things are dispersed and contradictory such that they can't enter into data, and we want to learn from others in order to figure out how to coordinate. Okay, so this is where Israel Kirzner, another important economist, comes along. And Kirzner says the missing idea here is the entrepreneur, is that person who goes out there and tries to figure out how we take the opportunities to remove mutual ignorance of market actors and benefit, right? So Kirzner brings us an idea from Mises, who we've talked about earlier in this class, that's the entrepreneur, and brings it to the Hayek problem, which is how do competitive markets help us learn? So Kirzner says, hey, Hayek, you were asking how competitive markets help us learn. The answer is the entrepreneur. And what does the entrepreneur do? The entrepreneur comes along, sees the opportunities to remove mutual ignorance of market actors. Okay, so this is an idea called sheer ignorance. All right, and this is what we mean by search versus discovery. Sheer ignorance is distinguished from other forms of ignorance by the fact that we don't know what we don't know. This is actually a really important idea that you've probably run into before in lots of different types of psychology or social science, and it's really promising to me, and hopefully to many other economists, that we're sort of rediscovering something that early schools of economics are actually built on. And so we want to distinguish between search and discovery. When we're searching for something, we know what we're looking for, right? I lost my keys. I know I had keys at one point. Where did I put them? So we begin this methodical process of trying to find it, right? Searches then are subject to actual ability to maximize the process, maximize the outcome, right? At some point, the cost of searching might be very high, such that further search is unwarranted. When we search, we take particular means, ends, and we try to figure out how is it we can find what we're looking for. Search behavior is a very real and important part of the market. So notice that I'm not throwing this away when I bring up discovery. But competition, though, is actually a discovery process, right? So entrepreneurial action is how we overcome mutual ignorance. We don't know what we don't know. And it constitutes the process by which prices serve a better surrogate of information than any other form of information exchange. And it solves this problem of how to coordinate, right? How is it possible that economies might move from situations of sheer ignorance, we don't know what we don't know, to ones with greater degree of coordination? So hopefully you're seeing this really beautiful idea and the reason that I wanted to bring you this information rather than this framework of business that you're often taught probably in many other classes is people want this or people want that, and how do we bring them that product? We have a much richer understanding of the world around us. We don't even know what we don't know, and markets are actually something that help us solve that, and that's this invisible hand idea. So Kirzner says the operation of the invisible hand, or equilibrium, if we want to get sort of mathy, is that once entrepreneurs receive an opportunity, they then marshal resources to try to take advantage of it. That entails putting together capital goods, including human capital, right? So things to produce things and people to produce it, right? And they formulate a plan of action, and then they budget on the basis of existing market prices. Prices convey information. Then this entrepreneurial plan is then put to the market test. So this results in profits or losses, which convey information. You gain good profits. That means, hey, this is a good thing. You should explore it more. This is where Kirzner brings an important idea, and this is that dynamic process of the market. There's then another round of opportunity perception, planning, budgeting, and repeat over and over as profit, loss, prices all interact. This is why it's very key not to interrupt that process, because this is the dynamic market process that gives us entrepreneurship. It's driven by entrepreneurial perceptions of what consumers want and how best to produce it. So entrepreneurs then are like scientists, proposing a hypothesis in the form of a budget and production plan, testing it against the uncertainty of the wants of the consumers. Right? This is one of the things that if you're not careful, if you don't think about markets carefully, you misunderstand. You say, well, markets bring people what they want. Yeah, they also bring markets things that people didn't even know that they want, right? I didn't know I wanted a smartphone until I saw one. That's because there was a discovery process in play that was accompanying the search process, right? So the vision of competition and entrepreneurship then is very different from this sort of perfect competition, this really trite model of economics, and some of which is industrial organization, and compared to this idea of emergent order that I'm bringing to you here in this class, right? And notice that this also has important implications for social welfare and different types of market structure, okay? So perfect competition then delivers this kind of optimality, right? And any deviation from that reduces the total gains of producers and consumers, right? Because we're just competing in this sort of narrow set of competition. Monopoly, as we'll see later in this class, is defined as the failure of the assumptions of perfect competition to hold, specifically those about the size and number of firms and how much power they hold over prices. All very important and something we'll explore a lot later in this class. The result then is that real-world deviations from perfect competition are seen as market failure, right? And that includes this really important idea that product differentiation is not competition. But product differentiation actually is competition, is central to competition, and is one of the most important forms of competition. And that's because the sterile mathematical view of a market gives us this pretense of knowledge. We start with knowledge. But in the real world, we don't actually know we don't actually have this knowledge. We don't actually know these things. One of those things we don't know is industry structure. Right? We don't know how many firms there should be, or how big, or how small, or what they should be making, right? Figuring out what the competitive process should look like is what entrepreneurial market process, a dynamic discovery process, does. When firms merge, for example, they're testing out to see whether the entrepreneurial hypothesis that a larger firm will be better able to create value than a smaller one. They're testing that. The only test will then be profit loss, right, as those prices feed back that kind of information. So nobody, not economists, not judges, not bureaucrats, not politicians, not people on YouTube making commentary on markets, know what's necessary for the market structure or for the firm itself, right? We have to have a dynamic process that then determines whether we have success or failure, right? So note that this has important implications for understanding monopoly. More on this later. Rather than seeing evidence of monopoly deviations as changes from perfect competition, a firm's power over price and size and differentiated products, these are actually ways in which we can see competition, right? So adding a camera to a cell phone isn't monopoly behavior to differentiate the cell phone so you can charge a different price. It's actually competition, which I think is actually intuitive. Sometimes economists, maybe they're too close to the forest, too close to the trees, so they can't see the forest. Whereas you, new to this idea, would be, well, yeah, of course, iPhone and Android phones are competing on the quality and type of their phones, right? Cars with backup cameras. That's an example of competition by differentiation. These are all attempts to discover, not search, but discover in the face of ignorance and uncertainty what goods consumers value and how best to make those goods through competition. Right? True monopoly is actually then the opposite of that. When actual or potential entrepreneurs are prevented from exercising their entrepreneurial judgment by legal barriers. Right? The most obvious example of these are legal barriers such as government licenses. Right? Taxi cabs, are licensed. You can't just come and compete with them. A good example of this is like Uber or Lyft. not allowed to compete because of legal barriers. These legal barriers then choke the discovery process by limiting competition. So they prevent entrepreneurs from having new opportunities, either from a closely competing product, a different way to provide it, or a completely different vision of what the product might be. You're then losing as a customer, right? Because you don't get the benefits of these product differentiations or lower prices, right? So real competition then might be called permissionless innovation. I can't remember if I mentioned that yet in this class. I'm sure that I will at some point, because we're going to talk about the work of Dr. Mike Munger. But he brings us this idea that competitive markets are actually a testing ground for rival conceptions of how to best serve consumers. And that's what's actually going to get us the discovery process. So to bring this all the way back around and talk a little bit about policy, competition policy is about allowing the discovery process of markets to work unhindered, devoid of legal barriers, to prevent entry and to protect the incumbents, and rather allow competition to come for those incumbents. Freedom of entry and a level playing field then for all competitors ensure that entrepreneurial profit-seeking motive generates economic coordination and the most value for consumers.